because I don't like to. We are now recording and we are now live.
Good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, March 30th. This is a meeting of the Curriculum Committee of the Darien Board of Education. First thing on our agenda is the World Language Department update, and we are fortunate to have Christina Mauricio here to give us an update, and Dr. Tramberg will help us as well. So I'll turn it over to you all.
I'll just say good morning, everyone, and turn it over to Christina to walk us through the slides.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you to the members of the Board of Education Curriculum Committee for giving me the opportunity to present an update on our secondary world language program and to share with you some plans for our program's future. Today, I will briefly review our department's thematic approach to instruction and provide you with an overview of how our curricula are currently structured. I will also share how we have been incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into our teaching practices for several years and how we highlight underrepresented voices. We are wrapping up our annual proficiency assessments in grade 8 and at the high school and have some preliminary scores which will shed light on how recent curricular changes have made an incredible impact on what our students can do with the languages they are learning. And then I will share how we are preparing for bringing on 2 new courses at Middlesex and DHS. And finally, I will share some upcoming curricular revisions and how our department is poised to meet our EduPlanet rollout with great success. It has been several years since I've had the opportunity to present to you, so I'd like to start with this graphic. In the world language world, we call this the themes bloom. All across the United States, world language programs like ours are governed by the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages Standards, or ACTFL, for world language instruction. 10 years ago, as programs sought to accelerate language instruction and open access for more students to study languages at a higher level, the College Board's AP World Language Program synthesized all of those standards into this Venn diagram. This diagram makes it easy for us to visualize what our students learn and categorize it into wider, broader themes that are all connected. And 5 years ago here in Darien, we made the transition to each course exploring one theme per marking period. This way, our students are able to take a deeper dive into the material over a longer period of time and truly master it. To illustrate this with an example, food, where we previously would have a 2-week unit on food as just a superficial topic, we now have a 9-week thematic unit on contemporary and daily life, where we explore how to make healthy food choices, how to describe your food preferences, and the historic origins of ingredients used to make certain cultural dishes. To that end, our curricula are currently structured in the order you see here. In addition to making a shift to thematic instruction 5 years ago, we also made a shift to backwards design, which puts our department in a good place to move into EduPlanet right away. Our units begin with a unit overview and supporting information for teachers. And this is where we tell the story of a unit, the why behind what we teach, and provide notes for instructors. For example, our 6th grade curricula in Spanish and French begin with a unit 0, which is intended to acclimate students to 5 days of language instruction at Middlesex, and more importantly, how to be an organized, independent middle school student in a Spanish or French class that speaks or attempts to speak in the target language for the whole class period. Then we list our thematic essential questions and supporting questions which act as a frame for the things students will learn. And by the end of each unit, students should be able to answer each of those questions using the new linguistic skills they have acquired and eventually take those skills with them into the next unit and the next school year and beyond, what we in the UBD world call transfer goals. Then we list out acquisition goals, also commonly referred to as essential knowledge or a toolbox. Here is where we explicitly state everything that students will learn: the vocabulary, grammar, and linguistics functions. If you think back to your own time in a world language class, your course's curricula probably started with this. In a backwards design model, the vocabulary and grammar a student learns is so that they can use it to do something, to listen to, speak, write, and read about what they are learning, and not the driver of instruction or of content. And finally, our curricula end with links to our resource folders and common assessments stored in Drive and our instructor notes. The instructor notes are how we exercise our responsive curricula, and there teachers can make notes about how to tweak lessons based on student performance in lessons and on common assessments within a unit, make recommendations for curricular shifts in subsequent school years, and account for how to adapt units of study to departmental, school, or board and district goals and initiatives, i.e. the Sealed by Literacy, Vision of the Graduate, or Mastery-Based Diploma. And all of these are summarized on the Curricula at a Glance public-facing documents, which are available on our department's curriculum page. World language instruction in general has always been at the forefront of furthering diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And for us, it is not something that's new or a list of buzzwords, because language itself is a cultural artifact. Learning another language puts you, the learner, in direct contact with the culture and people to whom that language belongs. The ACTFL standards that govern us guide us through the teaching of diverse cultures and languages with the 3 Ps: products, practices, and perspectives. When we teach culture through this lens, we channel our students' own experiences by exploring the ways in which we are similar to, rather than different from, the people and places they are learning about. And our curricula in particular challenge students to draw connections between themselves and the cultures they are learning across levels, regardless of proficiency. For example, a student with novice language skills can easily make these connections in the target language by learning about a cultural celebration, notable figures, typical food and dishes, famous artists, and traditional music. Furthermore, an intermediate to advanced learner can do those things while also being able to understand historical concepts, read authentic resources, and process contemporary issues. An example of this is our recent Lunar New Year celebrations in our Mandarin classes at DHS, which were recently highlighted in a recent issue of DHS Happenings. Students in Mandarin 1 celebrated this event through learning vocabulary and cooking New Year's dishes, and cooking, where did I go? Oh my goodness, cooking New Year's dishes, whereas students in Mandarin 4 made their own calligraphy following the traditional artistic method, explored why this year of the tiger is particularly significant for the Chinese people, and drew comparisons between Lunar New Year celebrations in Chinese communities across the United States. So again, we see how this approach allows students across levels to learn about the same products, practices, and perspectives in a way that is appropriate for what they understand about the world and what they can do with the language. I'd like to transition now to our yearly stamp assessment and some preliminary scores. The standards-based measure of proficiency is a computer adaptive assessment that calibrates a student's proficiency level in the 4 skill areas. Students can score novice, low from bottom to top, novice, low, mid, high, intermediate, low, mid, high, and advanced, low, mid, high. We've just completed testing at Middlesex, and despite COVID, these are the best scores our 8th grade students have earned since adopting this assessment in 2018, and not only highlights our students' efforts, but my colleagues' efforts as well. In both languages, our students are meeting or exceeding target. And the reason why students have a higher proficiency level in Spanish is because they begin learning the language much earlier in kindergarten. The data from, and I can go back to that if you have any questions about it. The data from DHS is preliminary and incomplete, as we have not completed testing in all languages just yet. However, most scores are in from French and Spanish, and these numbers represent a composite score of all juniors and seniors currently enrolled in these languages, with an overwhelming majority, again, scoring on or above target. And you will also notice that Spanish learners are getting into the advanced range in all 4 areas because of how much time they spend in our program. And next month, when all of our scores are in, I will be able to share the list of Sealed by Literacy earners from this year's graduating class. And in Darien, we award the Sealed by Literacy to students enrolled in our world language program, as well as students who are heritage speakers of languages other than English. And I predict that this year we will have the highest number of SEAL earners since adopting the program in 2017, not only in the number of students earning the SEAL, but also in the number of languages represented on our list. We have 2 new courses coming up this school year 1 of Mandarin 6 at Middlesex and AP Spanish Literature at DHS. The new Mandarin 6 course at Middlesex begins with the fundamentals of character writing by hand and on the computer, and in pinyin, which is the romanization of Chinese characters, and hones in on proper pronunciation and understanding tones. I do not need to go into too much detail here because on the different units of study, because you all have seen them already in my course proposal. But I do want to take a moment to note that while these units may seem basic and perhaps superficial in subject matter, in reality, they are the fundamentals of the language. And due to the complex nature of written and spoken Mandarin Chinese and the physical age of grade 6 students, our students will require a full year of study to be able to progress into more complex languages by starting with these topics here. And all the way on the other end of the proficiency continuum is AP Spanish Literature and Culture. And I also do not need to go into too much detail here with this because you are already familiar with the proposed course. And as a former teacher of this course, that considers this material to be her wheelhouse, I'm going to have to stop myself because I'm very, very excited for not only this content, but for the fact that our students at DHS will be able to take this course. But I will say that this course is the equivalent of a 4th or 5th semester university course, as evidenced by the literary genres shown here. And it is almost exactly like the AP English Literature course, the main differences being obviously that this course is taught in Spanish and that it comes with a prescribed reading list from the College Board. And my last slide, we have 4 writing and revision projects coming up at the end of the school year and in the summer. The first is a revision of French 6, which we are using as our first course for EduPlanet, to which we will subsequently add French 7 and 8 in the coming school year. And then, of course, Mandarin 6, because it is a new course. And we're also revising Spanish 8, which is the second course for EduPlanet. And Dr. Tramberg has asked us to begin with just 1 unit in 1 course, but because our world language curricula are already backwards designed and my colleagues are very accustomed to this model, we're going to push several steps forward and do 2 whole courses rather than just 1 unit. And we are now currently selecting our curricula for AP Spanish Literature and Culture. And in order to pass the AP audit, we must select one of the 4 sample curricula from the College Board. This is the AP Spanish Literature and Culture is the only literature course that is offered in the world language program at the College Board. And so what they do to make it easy for programs and schools to adopt this course into their program of study is they say, here are 4 curricula you can choose from. The list is the same for all of the curricula, but they just give us a framework and we just have to choose one based on what we think is best for our students. And speaking of things that are upcoming, we leave for Spain in 8 days. And the trip has been several years in the making and in the waiting. And because of you, it is finally here. So thank you very much. And that's all. And I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, Christina. That was
You're
a really, really nice overview of what you guys are working so hard to make our students have some excellent language experiences. I'm very excited about Spain.
you.
I hope you have a wonderful time. I will open up to board questions. Okay.
Thank you. You
Welcome.
answered a lot of my questions in your
Hi.
presentation, so thank you. I had a couple of questions around the stamp testing. I believe you mentioned targets,
Yes.
but I don't think we have them here. So,
Oh, so
and you
what are
also
they?
said that these are great scores compared to what
Mhm.
we've seen in the past. So
Mhm.
that's very reassuring. But for example, for the 8th grade results, the speaking numbers are lower. Is that as we would expect, or Is that an area that needs further development? Just if you could speak a little to that.
Yes. So to answer the first part of your question, what is the target?
Mhm.
So for a French program like ours, where students begin the first time that they take French, they begin in the 6th grade. And after being in that course for 3 years, meeting 5 days a week, 41 to 42 minutes a day, we expect that our students would be novice high or higher than that. The main difference between a novice, a person that is of a novice proficiency level, and let's say an intermediate proficiency level, is that they can function in all time frames at the same time. So for example, in speaking, they can speak in the present, in the past, and in the future. And that's where I call this almost like a ceiling, where you can get all the way to the top, but if you can't speak in the present, past, or future, you will never progress to the same level. And that's just because of the time that you spend learning the language. So you'll see on the French side, most of the students are in novice high or already reaching intermediate low, which is actually, I guess, going over that ceiling into the next level. The speaking, you'll notice that the speaking and the writing, those are the most challenging proficiency areas, just because those are the productive skills. So other than receiving a prompt, there's nothing in front of you. Whereas like when you're reading something, you can, use your circumlocution, or you can use other skills that you have from your English courses to help you get through that reading. But speaking, and it's expected that these two would be lower, just because those are the more challenging tasks and also the most challenging skills to acquire. And in Spanish, we want, what I share with my colleagues is we want them out of novice as quickly as possible, because our curriculum in Spanish 8 does present all major timeframes to the students before they leave. So they're in the program for enough time for us to be able to do that. So that's why most of them are in intermediate. And what I mean by range is that they're pretty evenly distributed, low, mid to high. And you'll see here again that speaking and writing, although they are lower, they're still overwhelmingly already in intermediate, somewhere in the intermediate range. Yeah.
Thank you. And listening is more of a comprehension read than a dictation, for example. I did a lot of dictation.
Yes.
In my early French days.
Yes. So listening on the stamp is very similar to the way we assess and also teach listening in our program, where you're asked to do lots of things, like you listen to a news broadcast, or you listen to someone talking about a certain topic, and you identify vocabulary words that you hear, you answer comprehension questions, you put sentences in order. It's, again, challenging for students, especially because we like to get them accustomed to listening to different types of pronunciation in different languages. And when you're taking a stamp test, it's not your teacher that you've been listening to for the whole year who might have a pronunciation from a certain country, and all of a sudden you hear, when the students hear me, they're like, why do you say those words that way? So they're not accustomed to hearing that. But it is comprehension, but it's not rote comprehension where the teacher is, like you say, in front of the classroom. Do you hear this? Yes, yes, yes. It's actually authentic listening that they're doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mrs. Otman.
Thank you. And to follow up on that with a little bit of history, when we brought world language into the elementary school, what was frustrating, and I wasn't on the board, Ms. Maurizio wasn't here, the example of what students would be able to do they will be able by 8th grade to say, where is my refrigerator? And it drove some of us crazy because, well, that's fantastic that you can say that sentence. It doesn't make sense. With Christina and as department chair, I will say, the idea that we are now seeing intermediate scores is the scaffolding that we've been looking for in terms of curriculum. We have scaffolding so that our kids are able to achieve and then have the opportunity to take AP courses and maybe college credit in the high school. So I think this is amazing work. These scores are, I'm so proud of them. All the concerns we had when we were really debating world language in the elementary schools, this shows the scaffolding that if done right, and done with intention and leadership, that we can really give a gift to our kids. I mean, I truly believe that foreign language is a gift to our kids, being able to speak different languages. So these are some of the most impressive scores I've seen. And I think you've really kind of stripped away those concerns of like, why are we teaching our kids a different language? There's a real reason, because it gives our kids opportunities.
Absolutely.
So thank you. These
Yeah,
are
you're welcome.
impressive.
If you look at, and again, these aren't complete yet, but if you look at the Spanish and the French, the students are already advanced. And even in French, where most of these students have only been studying French maybe 5 to 6 years, versus once we get to Spanish, it's 8 to 9 years. They are also in advanced. Intermediate is the most difficult proficiency level to get through, just because of how much you have to do. An intermediate proficiency level is like how we are speaking right now, and being able to interject into a conversation, follow up with a question that someone asks you with a response that makes sense. It's very difficult to get through that, but you'll see, I mean, in Spanish, it's, when I say advanced range, these students are comfortably in advanced, in low, mid, or high. We have some students who can't score any higher because the assessment doesn't let you score any higher. So they're doing extremely well. And the stamp itself, the management system that allows us to see the scores, will actually allow us to go back into the speaking and writing samples of students. So when you have a student that is towards the bottom of your target, you can actually go in and read what they wrote and listen to what they said. And because this assessment is happening to middle to end of the school year, we're able to ask ourselves, as my colleagues are able to ask themselves as teachers, what can I do for this group of students before moving them on to the next school year? So it's aligned to how we teach, and we're also able to see their actual scores and the things that they turn in. So it's a pretty remarkable assessment, and tells us a lot about the program.
So Mrs. Ackman mentioned the elementary school curriculum. Do you use this at all to inform that curriculum and how that is taught? And has that changed throughout your time here? And what do you think about the elementary aspect of it?
So at the elementary level, they use an assessment. It's called an integrated performance assessment. We use those at the secondary level as a common assessment for each unit of study. They use one sort of like a culminating experience for students. And it asks students to do the same thing that the stamp does, but it's created by our colleagues in the program and is directly related to what the students can do and what they are learning. What we found was, because we assess students in the 8th grade, we're able to say, we're able to sort of like walk backwards and say, this is what they can do at the end of 8th grade. And this is what they can do at the end of 4th and 5th grade when they take their IPA. How do we get them from 4th and 5th grade to here and beyond? And because of how well the elementary school students have been doing, we were able to make changes to our 6th grade curriculum, which then sort of moves the students up, so much so that 2 years ago, we in Spanish moved our kids up an entire level when they reached to the high school. So they were previously entering at Spanish 2. Most of them were entering at Spanish 2. They now enter at Spanish 3 or 3 honors, have the option to take 2, and Spanish 1 is really reserved for students that have never taken Spanish before. So where they previously had 2 places to go, they now have 4, which really allows us to tailor the language instruction to the needs of the students that are in the class. So it really all is linked. Yeah.
Evan, and I don't know if this is a question for you or for Mrs. Klein, but some of the negative comments that I hear about the world language program is that some special education students are not able to access it because that tends to be what they're pulled out of
Mhm.
for their services.
Mhm.
Is there a way to have that not happen, or is that just the nature of the beast? And unfortunately, that is what
Mhm.
happens.
We look at it every year. Though in Middlesex, we do use that time for related services or direct reading instruction or learning centers. We do have available when students do arrive to ninth grade to start with Spanish 1 or another language in 1. And that really does address their needs. I think there's so much that you can give up in Middlesex. And it is unfortunate, just the period design doesn't allow that, but we've looked at different ways and different configurations. There really is no way without compromising. For instance, sometimes we'll do that short flex period as a related service, but you don't want to compromise the related service time because you want to put in the world language. So it is a conundrum. We continue to look at it, but there's no remedy yet other than having more offerings, possibly also looking at other offerings in the following years. Thank you. That would be good. So we will continue to look at that.
Thank you.
And students.
Oh, wait,
can
one more
take-
thing.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sorry. Go ahead.
It also helps with students returning to district. So if they've never had a language, if they've gone to an independent school or a private program, when they come in, they have those opportunities for year 1 of language at DHS. So that helps also.
I think that's important to understand that even if you are at Middlesex and you are taken out of the language, you can go into the high school and you're not
Of course.
left behind. There are options for you.
And you can start any language at
Right.
level 1.
Right.
And by in Spanish, because now we don't have only Spanish 1 and 2. Some students that have had previous language instruction at Middlesex, but then are pulled out. At some point, we give them a placement assessment. So Spanish 1 may not always be the place for them to go. They may test into Spanish 2 because of their prior exposure and skills that they come to the program with. So
Right.
in giving the program more options, we now give different types of students different options based on their needs also.
Thank you for that.
I think there's just also a misconception sometimes that kids don't start at level 1 in the high school. And they do. Sometimes kids take French and then decide to switch to Spanish. Sometimes
Absolutely.
kids take Spanish and then are like, I really want to take Mandarin. So
Mhm.
entering, at least in everything I've heard from you, and experience, entering at level 1 doesn't preclude you from having a full, rich experience in a foreign language, which is the exciting part about Mandarin for kids who want to start that earlier. But I think we see it all the time. I watch it in the class groupings. I can tell, like when people switch from French to Spanish or Mandarin or, so I don't think entering at level 1 precludes you, but we have a lot of kids who want to do more. And so I think we're offering that. Although I might really get on that sign language program with Mrs. Klein.
The other possibility from the middle school scheduling presentation from spring of 2020 was the possibility of a language elective. So that scheduling committee, and I'll talk about that a bit when we get to the gifted update. That group is reconvening with the new administration to make recommendations for next fall. But in that last proposal, the idea of having, so this isn't replacing how language works now, but also giving an option for it to be in the elective rotation for students who either don't have access during the language instructional block or for students who might want to pursue a second language. So that is another possibility. So they don't have to wait until high school.
Thank you. Any other questions about world language?
Just,
Yes, Ms.
well, it's more of special education than straight up world language. So the students that are unable because of the scheduling in middle school and then come high school, want to get involved in a language, what are the extra supports for them? Is there special education available within the language? How does that work?
Okay.
They're beginning. Still on? Hello?
Yes, you're good.
You're on.
Okay. They're beginning with an introductory course. So as Christine said, they can start with just the basic skills in either of the languages they're taking. So the instruction is really specific to the language. Any accommodations they have in their IEP is an accommodation they have throughout all their classes. So those are the accommodations they would receive. There is no remediation in a world language that you're taking because you're requiring it consistent with as you're having the instruction, but all your accommodations are available. Also in DHS, you do have your learning options. You can go throughout the day. There's teachers there from every discipline, and you can stop into your connections, learning connections, and have those opportunities for a language-rich teacher to help support you. I do want to say that my experience with world language teachers is they make themselves available throughout the day, before and after, for students who have questions about the specific language. And of course, they're familiar with the IEPs and they know all the accommodations. So for instance, if you have an accommodation that says not penalized for spelling or punctuation in your native language, you are not penalized for spelling or punctuation in your world language that you're requiring.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, Christina. Oh,
I don't have any further questions. I'd just like to reiterate with what Ms. Ackman said, for your leadership within the department, for the people, our staff here in the department. It's really encouraging and obvious of the vision you have and the leadership. New courses, exciting opportunities for kids at different grade levels, experiences taking kids away, not just 1 year, but multiple years. These are the experiences that enrich your lives that they'll never forget. So thank you and the members of the department for your continued vision around world languages. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
supporting our work. Thank you.
Christina, how many kids are going to Spain?
58.
That's
Wow.
amazing. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great trip. Okay, we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is the gifted education evaluation follow-up with Dr. Tramberg and Julie Droller.
Good morning again, and thank you. Last spring, during our June final meeting, we had the presentation of our gifted program evaluation. And in November of this year, we talked a bit about what the steering committee, and the steering committee was actually one of the recommendations from that evaluation, was formed, and we shared the priorities. So we're going to talk about some progress with the priorities from this year and a look ahead to where we're prioritizing for next year. So what we had identified for this year were the establishment of the steering committee itself, the elementary math acceleration, which was an interesting recommendation that came through this process because, as I've stated before, math acceleration is not necessarily a product of students who are identified as gifted, because students who are not necessarily identified as gifted may be high achievers in math and still require access to those types of opportunities. The middle school schedule in general, which has been a regular conversation, and the Achievers program at the high school, which is our unique to Darien 9th grade program. That's an extension of the IDEA program. Just to make some connections to our vision, mission, and core values, especially the vision, because I love it so much that I keep trying to get a t-shirt made, preparing all students today to thrive in a changing world tomorrow. I just think it's the best vision statement that's out there. This is the membership of our steering committee, and we have representation of the teachers in the gifted program, some general education teachers, administration, and parent. And we do have a student who has not been able to join us yet, but that came up again as an important part of the steering committee. These were our priorities: the math acceleration, the middle school schedule, and then the threshold, the credit threshold, which we visited as a board last year. And there was a desire to know more about what actually would be in that program for it to be worthy of a full credit, because it only meets 2 days in a cycle, but it meets for the whole year. As we're looking ahead, we are looking at curriculum. That was one of the recommendations. There has been most concern expressed that came through the report, if you remember, is regarding the middle school curriculum and the middle school schedule. So those things go hand in hand, but there is a need to visit the curriculum across, mostly because there isn't too much student choice in the program itself. So once students have access, they are with their like-minded peers, which is an important attribute of a program, but there isn't too much independent exploration outside of a given topic. So we do want to look further at that. The other piece was exploring school-wide enrichment opportunities. So that is the enrichment for all philosophy. And there are very different philosophies out there on gifted education instruction. One is to provide specific programming for identified students. One is enrichment for all. And the recommendations that came through our evaluation is a hybrid of those two. So yes, we should be looking at the program itself, but we also want to provide more opportunities for all students so they have choice in their learning. And one place that we see that for next year in the current proposed budget is the Genius Hour at the middle school. And another piece that we have not taken a deep dive into is the professional development for staff. And Julie is here with me. I'll ask her to talk a little bit more about where we are with our elementary math acceleration.
So the math acceleration, we have another committee that's studying this. We have classroom teachers, gifted teachers, math specialists at the elementary level, middle school math teachers, and administrators. We have visited classrooms in grades 2 through 5 with students who are identified as gifted to see what their math instruction looks like in a variety of learners. So we have data from that. We have studied a lot of research, which has been interesting because there's research, a lot of different viewpoints come out of the research. We are looking at comparable district visits. That was a little bit challenging with COVID, but we are going to Wilton in a couple of weeks. We're going to Westport, New Canaan. Felicia and I have a Zoom call to talk about their programs. We have also studied our tri-state districts and what their math acceleration looks like when they start. What are the opportunities for onboarding and offboarding? So we've looked at all of that. We have also consulted with and are continuing to consult with Nicole Bridge, who has been working in all of our classrooms in all 5 schools. So she's actually seen what math instruction looks like. She has seen actually our process for placement. So we are consulting with her to get best practices. And she has done some work in math acceleration as well. And then we will be making a recommendation to the board.
Regarding the Middlesex schedule, I reviewed recently with Carolyn Rodriguez the recommendations that came from the spring of 2020. And we went back to the people that were on the committee. And we thought, based on the transition that's happened and the time that has passed, we wanted to bring that group back together to make sure they were well calibrated. And so they're working on those recommendations so they can be tightened and reflective of the vision of the current administration and provide access for more opportunities for students. Where the IDEA program fits in, the challenge is students have access to the program during lunch. And that it kind of got quiet for a while because of COVID. It didn't feel like a giant inconvenience, but now that the weather is nicer and students can eat with their friends again, it's starting to feel like, okay, this is a problem again. So we are looking at opportunities, but the challenge is something's got to give. So no matter what the solution is, there's some choices that need to be made. So if it does work as an elective within a rotation, the students are still electing to be part of the program and electing to not do something else. The other model is a rotation where students are pulled out of class once every cycle. So there's 7 periods, they would miss one academic class, or not necessarily academic, but any one of their periods over 7 weeks. So once every 7 weeks, they would miss math. Once every 7 weeks, they would miss English. That makes people nervous because they're missing some academic time. But then there's a balance of the part to balance is students who are identified in these programs are very often among the highest achieving students. If they miss math, in reality, it's not necessarily going to impact their math performance, but doesn't mean it's going to alleviate the anxiety they feel about not being in class and not being like the rest of their peers because they're missing class to go to another program. So that's the challenge that's there. And there's always the opportunity of keeping it the way it is in the lunch program, looking at opportunities during flex. So we are doing all of those things, but as you're aware, time is a finite resource. And at some point, students that are participating in the program will have to make a decision, which surfaces again when we look at the Achievers program. So many students from the middle school to the high school, that's when we see students choose not to continue with the program. And that's time. They're making a full commitment to take one of their periods and spending the whole year and using that as potentially their only elective. So as we're looking at the program, right now where we are is looking at access. One of the recommendations was, could we open up access to students in the high school? So that's something we feel like we can possibly make a recommendation for in the fall when we talk about changes to courses. So that would be through an application process of some sort that we would develop. And we would like to make a connection to, on the left side, the service learning component, which is one of those other recommendations, which is an attribute of high quality programming for gifted education, to make sure there's something back connecting to the bigger picture, the real world. So those are the two things we're looking at for sure. Emily Boston, who's the high school teacher in the program, is out on maternity leave. So we haven't been able to talk to her too much, and she's a big part of the knowledge of the program and where it's been and where she would like it to go. So we're going to definitely include her. There's a ripple effect to it. So if we make a recommendation for full credit that's supported, or if it becomes a letter grade and that's supported, that's a substantial change to the program. And at the same time, if we opened up access, it could change the dynamic of what the program is and its connectedness to being a part of our gifted education programming. We don't want to lose that part of it. So it's complicated, but we are hopeful that we can make a recommendation in the fall within the timeline for the next budget cycle. And we're glad to talk about any of the where we are on gifted education.
Thank you. I'll open up to committee questions.
Mrs. Worm looks like she's ready to go.
I felt like I saw
defer there.
everyone's mouth open at least once during the
Yeah.
presentation.
All right.
So I have a couple questions, comments. So not sure where to start. Let's start high school and work back. So one question is more for the board, because obviously the administration had already made a recommendation for it to go full credit and the board did not vote for it. So I'm kind of curious what the board needs to do that. And if administration is supplying what they asked for last year, right? So that they can do that, because obviously, yes, they have only meets twice a week, but they're doing a lot of work on their own, depending on their project, what have you. We all know that the threshold is different, and that probably needs to, be a little bit more cleaned up. The other thing is middle school, the idea of obviously pull out, not a great option. And obviously we've been discussing the lunch for a long time. That's when they lose a lot of students because of the fact that it's a lunch pullout. We're asking kids that are often, socially not really where some of their peers are to then
Tara,
take
can you
that
just
lunch.
speak in the mic? I just have the copier. I can't.
Sorry. So one of the things that you didn't mention that as an option, you mentioned a couple different options that I know some other districts do, is work it into social studies and use that as the gifted period so that they are not being pulled from lunch, also not missing an academic class, because as you mentioned, yes, typically some of these kids are the highest achievers and therefore also end up in that highest level math. Not all of them, but there is definitely a large group that do. And even though they're high achievers, that's still a really hard place to be. And most of them do need to be in there in the class and getting that instruction. So those are some of my.
Sure. If I can respond to just a couple parts of that. One of them, there is another option we were looking at within the lunch as a potential adjustment for next year that doesn't change the integrity of how we do the program, but grouping students more by interest, keeping consistency with teacher, things like that, because the grade levels meet, the same grade is meeting the entire lunch period. So for the shift of the makeup of the group to change just based on what team the students are on isn't necessary. And one of the strengths of the program is the cohort that develops in the elementary schools. They're with the same peers for an extended period of time. And in the middle school, that's a shift of a dynamic of a group every year. So that's something we can do potentially in the interim. So we are looking at that. I can definitely explore the social studies piece more. And as far as the Achievers program, you can hit the nail on the head with what I'm struggling with right now is the program can be very rigorous or it cannot be very rigorous based on the challenge that's accepted, the mentor the student has, but a credit is a credit. And what motivates students to work hard would be often a grade, unfortunately, at the end, not necessarily the intrinsic motivation that we so hope will motivate students to achieve at the highest level all the time. So we're just wrestling with that dynamic because even though those four things are separate, they're so intertwined that once a recommendation is made related to one of those boxes we're trying to check, it affects all of the others. So we're just taking time to make sure we do that well.
I also think, that the discussion of talented and gifted, in particular the Achievers program, came up a number of times regularly, maybe every year, every other year type thing. I think the board just was looking for, can we have a comprehensive look at this? And as opposed to just perhaps every year or something, this topic comes up, maybe through the budget process or otherwise. And that was a time just to sort of step back and give us the charge to actually do a comprehensive review of it. So if there are changes that are going to come through it, I don't think this is on, but if there are changes that are coming through it, it will come through the comprehensive report and also the budget process, the way the recommendations from this will for next year. That's the way it is.
Mrs. Adler.
So I'll do it the other way. I'll take off where Mr. Storm left off, middle school and then go to high school. Middle school, I do think we've heard this problem and I do think that it is real. I think it's an issue the board needs to take up. There's such little time to socialize. And if we've learned anything from the pandemic, socializing, being with your peers is of true value. So I think we need to solve it. Part of the problem is it's a discrete group of kids and we're trying to fit it in someday. So I don't know, I would argue social studies is an academic, and if you're moving forward to history and things. So if there's a concern about missing academics, we should look at the breadth of that.
Social studies is still taught. It's just the way it's taught and they still would be learning the same things as far as I've heard.
I would just say that if we're worried about missing academics, we should look at academics as equal. That said, if we're looking at choice and we can make this an elective type period where kids are together with the same teacher and there's choice, and I don't know what requirements we have to hit. I mean, you always have to have health and there are certain state requirements we have to hit. But that might be a way that kids can choose, have a designated period, have a teacher, be with the same peers, because I do think in these classes, trust among peers is also really important. So they can feel the need to be their own wonderful selves, because often they have ideas that their other peers aren't having. And so you want to trust in that group. So I don't know exactly how that would work with schedule, but an elective based would work. Or would seem to be a better model to me than missing any academic, math, history, English, foreign language, any of those. High school, to answer first the question, because I was one of the biggest questioners of why we were moving to a credit. We heard it at the Board of Finance last night. They've asked us to look at programs that aren't always as active as we'd like them to be, or to do an assessment. And what we were seeing was considerably lower numbers in achievers. And so the question became, is that program a program that we should transition to something else? The administration came back to us and said, no, give it a full credit. And that disconnect was sitting for us. Either we need to make it more robust with some more metrics, so we understand what the projects are, or we need to look at a different type of program to serve the needs of these students. But that's exactly what we were doing. And we heard it come up last night. Are you reviewing programs? Are you reviewing which programs to keep, to lose? And achievers fell into that bucket. What I find interesting as we talk about opening up the program, now that we know there are no barriers to classes, if we make this a full credit class with a grade attached, any student is eligible to take that class. And that also significantly changes what achievers originally was. That doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It just means that we are changing what the achievers program is. And as part of a gifted program, it is significantly changing. So I don't know how you wrestle that. But as I hear, those are the questions that come to my mind. If the idea is we really need to create a space for certain types of learners to thrive, which we do in lots of certain ways, then giving achievers a credit in a grade changes that dynamic. I don't know if I'm saying that. I think you all know how I'm saying it, and I don't know if I'm saying it coherently, but so I feel like we're still stuck. And one of my questions would be, and maybe talking to students and achievers, is what are you hoping to get out of this class? What opportunities for that goal are there in DHS? Is this in the right sequencing at the right time? And tell us why this is important to you, because then I think as a board, we can start to wrestle with how to achieve their goals.
So we do plan on talking to students again because of all the aspects of the program evaluation last year. I did them pretty much side by side with Teresa Rangel when she was doing the evaluation. The time with students in focus groups was the most valuable and insightful of any other part. So those conversations need to continue for sure. The challenge that is embedded throughout the considerations and commendations is there is a high level of satisfaction with the program, but also things that we want to change. And sometimes making those changes affects the things where there's a high level of satisfaction. So that's pretty much what we're wrestling with. And each of these, even though we're trying to compartmentalize them, it's very hard to do any one of these things in isolation. But it does feel like we're making progress forward at the same time. The other piece that I don't want to lose the opportunity to mention as far as something we need to look ahead to, because if you look at the literature of where gifted and talented education is this traditionally the title and identification, but there's much less on the label of gifted. It speaks much more to student talents as the research base is moving forward. And we are kind of swung the other way on the gifted label. So there has to be a look at the identification process and how do we tap into talents and strengths of the gifted area versus you're identified based on our process. And now you all have access to exactly the same programming. So that's not independent of the curriculum, right? So if we change that process, we're looking at a curriculum that is more flexible for students and gives them choice.
Tara, then
Oh, sorry.
Well, could you just talk about that a little bit more about the identification process? Because it has changed multiple times
It
over
has,
the past
yes,
few years. Like
and-
I don't even know what it is anymore.
Yeah, so it has changed even recently. I think it's less than 5 years. I think the
Oh,
last
yes.
change was.
Mhm.
So that process is sound. It's good practice. What we don't have a process for right now is looking specifically at talents that don't fit the traditional metrics. So we do have a process for teacher recommendation, for parent recommendation. But what if a student is gifted as an artist? What if the student is gifted as a musician? What if the student is gifted as, I mean, you name it. There's best practice would be to also have an extension that would welcome that as well. And then the district becomes challenged with, just because you identify a student doesn't mean you necessarily have to provide service in that area. But if you have a musically gifted student, it would be helpful for the music teacher to know that the student has identified gifts in that area. A very strange story, when I was cleaning out in my last move, I came across my master's thesis data and I found my list of the students that I had used. And I gave a music aptitude test for my master's thesis. And later I became the assistant principal of the high school and I had all of my students from elementary school. And when I looked at the list of who visited the assistant principal's office compared to who had a high music aptitude, I was like, wow, if I only knew back then that this kid who I saw in my office had such a high music aptitude, could I have attended to their gifts to help them be an orchestra? I don't know, but it was just really insightful information that sometimes we miss the opportunity to make sure we're recognizing and honoring the gifts that students have, because all students, whether or not they're identified, they have gifts, they have assets. And if we can tap into their assets as early as possible, we're going to make them have a more engaging experience throughout. So that's the big picture enrichment for all. But there's a way we should be also tapping into that through the gifted identification process.
So on that, are you also looking at, more of that 2E component? The kids that do have a really high IQ, but maybe on the autism spectrum.
Yes,
or-
that's a great example. So right now, of our 260 identified students across the district, 14 are twice exceptional. We need to make sure that our process is not creating barriers for students to access a program where they might have gifts. That's the basic story. And that's where we are with, as we look to review that as the next wave, those are the things we want to look at. If we think the conversation we're having now is complicated, it gets more complicated when we start to do that, right? But the desire to make the program the best and what our students and meet the needs of our students is why we're doing the work we're doing.
Thank you.
So back to math. And often, actually, it's been quiet for a little while, but for a lot of us, an oft debated issue of
Never quiet.
acceleration. I think it's great that we need to provide opportunities for children. I mean, I would argue, to your point, talents in math and English and give them opportunities to excel. What I get worried about is putting up barriers unintentionally. And we have heard this at the middle school level several times. Once you get tracked in sixth grade, it's very hard to move outside of that track. And that really then dictates your math path forward into high school, unless you choose to double up on math or get an outside tutor or test into a program. And so I wonder, as we do this, are we doing this with intention to also understand that learners emerge at different times, right? You might have been more interested in tag in fifth grade than math, but by seventh grade, you might really have found your niche. And are we really looking at how to give kids those opportunities? Because once we decide where someone is in math in sixth grade, they're a very different human in ninth, 10th grade. And right now we're pretty narrow on how to do that, or you have to go to, I would say, difficult lengths to change that. So are we looking at that? Because we've asked to look at that for a number of years.
You want to take that? We definitely have that discussion.
Yes, we talk about this quite a bit. I'll say one thing and then I'll turn it over to Julie, because this is one of our regular conversations. But the fact that from fifth to sixth grade, there's an opportunity for students to not only accelerate, but like double accelerate. There's not something magical that happens for most kids between fifth and sixth grade that now they're ready to go arguably 3 times as fast. So where in their learning would it have been most appropriate to start to accelerate them? Because I think the endpoint isn't that much different. So if we look at where high school is,
Arguably.
but most kids are going to end probably near where they are. But if a student double accelerates and has really struggled by that, if they're struggling to do that, but we're ready to do that one level of acceleration earlier, they could have gotten there if they were accelerated at the appropriate time. Some students are only ready to, within a unit, perhaps go outside that unit of study. And then that model becomes more curriculum compacting. So you go out for this, and then you come back, and then maybe you're with the class for that unit, then the next unit comes up and you're out again. So there's all different ways to look at it. And sometimes the answer is not just one answer. And that even with scheduling, it's not just here's the new schedule option. It might be you can do this or this, and it might be the same type of recommendation that we bring forward with math. It might be this or this and this, I should say, because it's not necessarily one model that's going to meet the needs of hopefully all of the students.
Perfect. That's exactly what we've been talking about.
No, so I guess my 2 cents on this as a curriculum committee that's really kind of diving deep in this. I like the idea of looking at different points for kids to accelerate and not waiting until fifth grade, because sometimes for kids, it's just daunting to think I'm going to have to go 3 times as fast. And maybe had they been able to accelerate a little earlier, it wouldn't feel like such a jump. I do think it's important to look back. I would argue for some kids, by the time they're hitting their junior year and they're having to look at, and I know we all don't like, and I'm not suggesting teaching to the test. You've all heard me up here that that's a bad idea. But kids taking ACTs and SATs, there are certain math that is presumed to have had. And if they have gotten kind of streamlined in a math track and they haven't hit certain maths, it can be difficult coming up against that, right? And I do think here in Darien, we're blessed with people who are willing to invest in education and find ways around that. But I do think as a school system, we have to look at what opportunities are we providing for kids to accelerate, who are ready to accelerate in second grade, and what opportunities are we looking for kids who come into their own in any given subject at, seventh, eighth grade. I think we do it well at the high school, but math is one of those things that is particularly scaffold. You can't skip algebra 2 and go think you can do calculus. I'm hoping that's right. I'm not-
That's a good analogy. That's right.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. That's a
Okay,
good one.
thanks. So I do think as we look to accelerate, I also think we need to look that learners emerge at different points. And what I don't want to do is have such severe tracks that kids don't have opportunities when they start learning and growing to achieve more if they want to.
For sure. And one of the things that we are learning is that we absolutely cannot skip any content. And we're also looking at how are we differentiating and providing those opportunities for our learners that need to be challenged in all grades.
So to that end, has there been, I'm thinking at the elementary level, has there been consideration to doing, instead of doing differentiation within a classroom, can you do grade level differentiation? So can you pull 3 kids from Mrs. Smith's class, 3 kids from Mrs. Jones' class? That's a scheduling nightmare, but that might be a way to create more flexible cohorting so that throughout the years, things can change.
So that is something that we're looking at, but also looking at how do you provide those opportunities so that all students have the benefit of the rich conversation and those rich tasks that are, high ceiling, low floor, and
Yeah.
really are differentiated.
It's a tricky
No easy
ball of wax.
task.
Yeah.
I had a quick question just on the how to handle pulling out for idea in middle school. Unless it's changed, my understanding is at the elementary, we do the pull out on a rotation basis. And I understand that some kids enter the program in middle school, so they haven't been accustomed to that routine. However, do we know that kids immediately become anxious about missing a class every 7 weeks as soon as they hit 6th grade, where they weren't anxious about it in 5th grade?
I asked them about that during the focus groups last year, and it was about 50-50.
Okay.
So just the idea of it, the students were visibly stressed out just by me asking the question. So yes, and in the elementary level, there's DI block, and most of the time they're taken out of DI, so they don't feel like they're missing something. And others, I will share because the student shared, if they were missing something, they didn't feel that stress of, if I miss math today, I'm going to be fine. And that goes to our desire to make sure math is appropriately challenging every day for all students.
Thank
So,
you.
I mean, arguably, part of that is if the kids know they're going 3 times faster and they're missing, there's a stressor there, right? So again, to your point, starting that process earlier for kids who are ready might alleviate some of that anxiety. And maybe not all of it, and maybe that's still not the right way to do it, but I think the feedback I've heard at this board and the feedback I've heard as we've talked about math throughout the years is part of what these kids value and as part of their identity is how well they do in school. So if you take them out of something and they feel as if they're not achieving their stress, if we maybe pace that a little differently, and it's not 3 times all of a sudden faster in middle school, we might be able to alleviate their anxiety, which I think is overall good for the whole child.
Yes, and I would say there's a parent piece that goes with that and the teacher piece as well,
Mhm.
because it's a shared anxiety from what I've seen.
Yep, agreed.
Makes
No,
sense. Thanks.
I love that you guys are looking at acceleration in elementary school because much like all the comments that were made, yes, being pulled out in elementary school, these kids are not being challenged. So it's really not a big deal for them to miss class. They could basically just not go to school and, hand in their little assignments. And then they are put into double accelerated in middle school, which is super stressful because they should have been accelerated all along. And I think it's also going to open it up to more kids, right? If there's acceleration done at an earlier level, I think we're missing kids that could be in that 6th grade double accelerated, which no longer would be double accelerated, obviously, because it would just be a natural transition.
what did you first say there? I don't know.
I'm not
When
sure
you,
what-
when you said about the students in elementary school were not being challenged, did I pick that up right?
Oh, yes.
Right?
For
Okay.
years.
Right.
For
Okay.
years in math specifically, which is why this conversation has been happening for 20 years.
So I just would, I just would put it in some context a wee bit, right? Yes, we've recognized it as a dynamic. It came through the report. We're addressing it. I'm just saying.
No, I
because
haven't had kids in
I'm just
elementary
saying
school
because
for
it's a sweeping
for
comment.
years
I
now.
understand people have talked about it. We've recognized it. We're addressing it. I just would be cautious of saying that no students are. being
No,
scheduled.
of course, absolutely. Some kids are. I'm talking about a small subset. We were discussing
okay. I
those,
just
no,
want-
we were talking about those kids that end up in that math
okay.
3 and 6th grade. Absolutely. Majority of kids are where they should be and challenged. We're talking about a small group of children that I feel needs haven't been met.
So I would feel better saying,
Mathematically.
I would feel better saying that we work to challenge all of our kids. There are some kids who could do even more. And so that it is probably great that at this moment in time, we're really taking a deeper dive into how to do that. But I think we look to challenge all of our learners.
I am just, we all know that I have that group, I hear that group chatter quite often, and it is a very small subset. It is a small subset, but, it's been an ongoing. And yes, we have looked to do more, and I'm just happy that it's finally going to come to fruition.
We are grateful to you all for
Yeah.
working on this.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add, Mrs. Droller, thank you for your update because
Yes.
it sounds like a very, very thorough approach on a very difficult topic. So I look forward to hearing more.
Yes, thank you. And is the goal, I know you said you're going to be presenting things to us. Is the goal to change things for next year? Or are we still 2 years out?
We would be making recommendations throughout. I would say we would have an idea of the recommendations this summer, and then a more formal presentation in the fall, just in case there are any implications for the budget process.
Thank you both.
And the curriculum process.
Correct.
Very much so. And I will also need to say on the record, the professional development process for teachers, if we're asking them to, if we're doing anything with how that schedule works at the elementary level, that would be a big shift.
Right, for sure. Thank you. We'll move on to public comment. Are there any public comment in the audience? Or I don't see anybody on. Oh, wait. I see. Yeah,
Oh,
Kate,
someone
says
else?
Katie.
We have one,
Okay.
Miss Katie Loveland. You are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. Good morning. I always very much appreciate these subcommittee meetings in particular. So have a few comments. First, I just want to say thank you to Ms. Mauricio. I always enjoy your presentations, and I really hope that more parents will be able to come back and view this. For one reason is that I think that these presentations and this in-depth discussion about what our curriculum is and how it relates from grade to grade, from grade level and building level highlights the just great importance of the department chairs. So thank you for your role in that and upholding it to such a high standard. I could not agree more with Dr. Adley's comment about the life-changing enrichment and worldview expansion that the trips provide. I especially appreciate your comments on a connection to DEI and the explanation of the 3 Ps. I was really happy to hear about the excitement for the expansion of languages offered to DPS students. And I think that this is a great example of how we can continue the excellence of our existing programs without being complacent or stunting growth for fear of diminishing others. I was really encouraged by congratulations, Dr. Tranburn's comments on the possibility of a language elective. I hope that this type of discussion continues and the creative problem solving will continue. In relation to adding programs or I should say adding languages and looking at ways that we can get kids in those classrooms, I have to bring up ASL again. I know that this is championed by some of you at the table and certainly by a lot of parents in town. So I just would like to say again to please continue that conversation. ASL would obviously be especially valuable to students with hearing impairment, but it would also be a boon for students who have language-based learning differences. You know, one example would be a child with a dyslexia profile. You know, Spanish starts in kindergarten, and a lot of children aren't even identified as having language-based disorders, but they're already into a second language. And then you can think about how they go to the middle school and maybe they have to drop a language. And then, you know, further down the road, parents start to worry about, well, what are colleges requiring for entrances and foreign language requirements? More to come on ASL, but can't go without that plug. Regarding the gifted program, I'm very, very happy to hear the conversation about access. I would love to see the administration consider opening access to this type of programming to more students. The current criteria is very rigid and narrow, and I don't feel that it adequately recognizes the wide variance in what comprises an individual educational profile, or the very common reality that most people, and not just children, are simultaneously high achievers in one area, or more than one, but not all. It's great to hear that you're talking about opening the access to the high school, but you know, I have to ask about the elementary and middle school as well. I very much appreciated Ms. Ockman's comments about giving access to students who develop as students beyond the early identification years. Special education remediation is a great example of this. Again, coming back to a dyslexia profile, you know, you will have a student who doesn't have
You're
an
almost at
issue.
time.
Okay, thanks, I'll speed up. You know, content comprehension versus independent reading, high math ability to story problems. Okay, thank you so much. More later.
Thanks, Katie. Any other public comment?
There are no more raised hands at this time.
Okay, thank you. May I have a motion to adjourn? Ms. Worm, thank you, everybody. Our next meeting is April 28th.